Okay, so today we're going to be talking about demand response in relation to the data center industry. But before we do, I guess it would be good to understand a little bit about yourself and in particular the I3EYP greenhouse gas abatement group. I think I've got that right. Sort of what that is and what your objectives are, which is obviously the organization that has produced the demand response white paper that we're going to talk about.
So in terms of I3 and EYP, we've been long standing partners over a number of years, and both of the companies are passionate about sustainability and reducing the impact of data centres on the environment through the reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions. So off the back of that, the group was formed, and the group at the moment is currently researching a number of low carbon technologies. And the reason for doing that is to try and help demystify the practical applications of these technologies within the data center industry to help reduce that carbon emission factor, and also to try and achieve the net zero carbon data centers by 2030, which is going to be a real challenge, obviously, and everyone's striving towards that in the industry at the moment.
Okay, so I guess the big picture, the background to demand response is grid decarbonisation. I suspect most people are familiar with the idea. The pressures, I guess, are in simple terms, the digital world is exploding. So we've not only got the developed world, which is increasingly using more and more sort of digital applications, digital devices, but we then got the whole of what we call, I guess, the developing world, which is beginning to come online. So there's a huge sort of rise in demand for power. At the same time as we're theoretically, as you say, heading towards net zero, trying to reduce, well, we can't eliminate the use of power, but obviously make it more environmentally sustainable. And the simple solution to that seems to be wind and solar. But I say the simple, it's not normally as easy as that sounds. So can you explain what solar and wind are capable of doing and what else maybe needs to be in that mix for the renewables and sustainable energy resources?
So yeah, like you say, solar and wind is going to play a big part in it, but unfortunately, it won't be the single thing that will solve that challenge moving forward. However, the solar and wind will continue to assist in that challenge moving forward. But the big issue with the solar and wind, as we all know, is it's intermittent, so it's not always there when demand is there. So in order for us to harness that and utilise that, then there needs to be some form of storage of that surplus energy. When the wind is blowing, when the demand is low, then we need to be able to save that energy, store it somewhere, and then be able to redeploy that energy when the utility demand is much higher and the grid is maybe not quite capable of supporting that amount of power from purely wind and solar at that point in time. So that brings in the form of storage on site, remote storage near wind farms, near solar farms, to then help support that grid in those times of higher demand. And then another potential opportunity for that excess wind and solar power when the demand is low is the potential to produce green hydrogen. And that green hydrogen then could be used to support transportation fuel power plants that can utilise hydrogen generators moving forward. And as you've probably seen in a lot of the press recently, there is a big push for especially local authorities, busing companies, all trying to move towards that hydrogen fuel. So if you can start to utilise that excess energy that would otherwise be curtailed wind and solar power, then it's of benefit to the greenhouse gas emission and reduction of carbon into the environment.
Okay, and in terms of the renewables themselves, you've alluded to the I guess the slight unreliability factor, but so is that the main issue in terms of integrating renewables into the power grid, or are there other concerns about sort of wind and solar?
So I think one of the biggest things is obviously the cost of doing all of this, and that's predominantly associated with the construction of the solar and the wind farms. They're generally not in the easiest locations to get construction traffic materials and personnel to. And generally, by default, the location, the transmission, getting the power from those locations to where it needs to be used can provide a challenge, and it generally requires a significant amount of new transmission infrastructure to get you from A to B. However, like I said, the renewables do bring enormous benefits, but they are intermittent, and with them being intermittent, they generally cause some form of power quality issues, mainly around the voltage and the power frequency fluctuations with them coming on and off grid. So that does increase the grid instability portion of renewable energy, unfortunately. And what that does mean that we do need to then start to look at those energy storage sites to help flatten out that fluctuation as these large-scale wind and solar plants come off and online throughout the year. And the other big thing, I suppose, is the large-scale deployment of the solar and wind generation has changed the power systems and the power system markets in terms of pricing. And traditionally, that pricing would have been based around the marginal generation costs and the fuel. And most of the generation capacity was considered dispatchable and available throughout most of the year. But like we say, with the solar and the wind, that's not the case. But the one big thing is it doesn't require fuel. And there's very little in the way of marginal generation costs associated with the wind and the solar. But like we say, it's only available when the sun shines and the wind is blowing, unfortunately. Another big issue that we have is trying to match that variable renewable energy source against the supply and demand of the society that we live in. And that becomes a big challenge. And in order to do that, the utility has to hold some form of generation reserve to balance the grid. And unfortunately, that normally takes place of some form of carbon intensive fossil fuel plant, which is typically going to be expensive to start, and it's required to run for extensive periods of time when that wind and sun isn't available to produce that energy. So there's a big mix there of aspects in terms of how you integrate the renewable energy, how you balance the grid, and how you deal with the grid fluctuation in terms of voltage and frequency.
Okay, so demand response, as I understand it, is an opportunity to help address that fluctuation in the grid, and the data center industry has potential to be involved, but historically it is sort of shunned. Well, I won't say shunned, perhaps is a strong word, but it is decided not to get involved in demand response. What are the reasons behind that sort of non-participation?
Yeah, so like you say, they really haven't taken it up to date, and I think a lot of the main reasons for that is there is a lack of awareness of demand response programs and policies within the industry. The demand response opportunities to date are potentially being unsuitable for the data centers. Moving forward, hopefully that will change. There's that perceived additional risk to the critical loads that they're concerned that by operating in some form of demand response, they're putting their critical IT load at risk. It's not their core business also. So the business is about providing IT and not operating as a power plant. There's also the complexities around the implementation of the demand response and operating it moving forward. And then you've got the whole challenge of interfacing with utilities, which is always difficult at times. And when you add the extra complication of demand response, that brings in its own challenges. And then you've got the regulation issues in terms of how often you can operate diesel generators, for example, in terms of emissions. So that all adds to the factor of just being challenging to participate in the demand response in the early days. But I think over time, that's going to change. The grid is going to start to rely upon data centers and start to see data centers as small localized power plants that can help to support the grid moving forward as it adds more and more renewable energy to it.
Yeah, so as I understand it, the white paper, the I3 EYP greenhouse gas abatement group has produced, you're basically suggesting that now is a good time to revisit the idea of demand response, particularly obviously in relation to the data center sector.
Yeah, so like you said at the beginning of the call, the whole decarbonisation of the grid, if we take that a step further, like globally, large and small economies, they've all declared their intentions to decarbonise their grids. And in doing so, what they're doing is they're putting a lot more emphasis on those low carbon energy sources, such as the hydro, your nuclears, like you mentioned, biofuels, and mostly at this current moment in time is the renewable sources in terms of wind, solar, and to a lesser extent tidal. And as we know, all of those are intermittent, which brings its challenges again. By decarbonising the grid, the removal of those large fossil fuel power plants, like we mentioned before, they are causing some grid reliability issues. There's that supply and demand balance that needs to be struck. There's a huge amount of reliance put on the renewable energy, especially wind and solar at the moment. And like we said previously, that energy all needs to be stored to be reused in another fashion. But by utilising the abundance of redundant components in terms of UPSs, battery storage, and on-site generation within data centres, the group believe that the industry as a whole is in a prime position to support that grid and reduce the carbon emissions, not only of the data centres, but also from a grid perspective moving forward.
Okay, yeah, so I guess the obvious opportunity you've outlined there is helping to reduce carbon emissions, both for the data center facilities, but also, I guess, more generally society in the way that the data centers can augment the the wider power grids. There's also, I guess, obviously data centers don't exist to sort of sell power as such, but there's also an opportunity to make some money out of this. How does that work?
So one of the things is to consider is the marginal emissions in terms of the utility. So the utility brings different types of generating plant onto the grid. And this is relevant when the demand reaches a point such as the utility network needs to start other forms of generation, for example, an oil fired generator. So if you think of an example where you've got a grid that's consuming 20 gigawatts worth of power, for example, and that's been supplied by, let's say, 7.5 gigawatts worth of wind, 7.5 of PV solar, and then you've got a gas turbine plant producing the remainder, all of that running to match the load. And then you have a demand change and you add 100 megawatts onto the grid at a certain point in time. So at that point, that utility grid needs to bring on another form of generation, and typically that would be the fossil fuel consuming oil-fired plant, unfortunately. So that has a certain grid emission factor, and let's say that's for an oil fuel generation, it's like 770 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So when you start to think about that, you're starting to add in a hell of a lot more carbon dioxide to the environment. So if we consider the situation where we've got a large data center, let's say it's 100 megawatts as well, and that can react to that change in grid demand and switch the on-site generation start to run on island mode, and providing those generators have a lower emission factor than that grid at that point in time, then by bringing those systems online and mitigating the need to start up an oil-fired generator system, you're going to reduce those marginal emissions of the grid during that point of time. So from that perspective, the data center at that point can then generate an income for providing that service to the grid and also helping with those reduction of emissions. So this is just one example of where the data center, from a demand response perspective, can help with that GHG abatement and reduce that average carbon footprint and the marginal emissions of the utility. But the extent of that GHG reduction is obviously heavily dependent on the location of the site, the location of the grid, the utility fuel mix at that time, and the emissions of the standby generation on site, whether it be from diesel, biofuels, HVO, gas. It's all going to have a factor, and it all has to be considered as an overall approach, and it's just not one single approach that's going to fit all scenarios in all countries.
And in terms of demand, I mean, demand response is a very simple phrase, but as I understand it, and I understand it to a certain extent, but hopefully you can explain, there are different types of demand response service, for example, load curtailment. It'd be great if you could perhaps outline the main ones and explain, what each of them are, what they do, and I guess as well to the data center industry, the opportunities, the commercial opportunities around them.
Yeah, so I think typically there's probably four key ones that we'd see as potentials for data centers, and I'm sure there will be other ones that present themselves in the future that will be of benefit. But the first one, like you say, load curtailment. So from a data center perspective, it's basically load shedding in its simplest form. And this is the most obvious type of a participation from a data center perspective, where it just disconnects from the grid and runs in generator and island mode. Another potential option is load shifting. So that's where the consumer, the data center, reduces its power consumption during peak demand times and shifting that energy usage to another time. There is challenges in that in terms of the wholesale and the co-location data center market, where they don't have control over that compute. So from that perspective, it brings a bit more of a challenge. But from an end user owned data center, for example, if they can control when they do certain compute activities, when their storage resources are used, then they can potentially shift that to different locations and do that work at a slightly different time to take away that pressure on the grid at specific times. Another option would be the short-term operating reserve, the store. This is where the utility would request power when actual demand is higher than they forecast it to be, or in the event of an unforeseen issue in terms of their generating. So the demand response from that point of view would ask the site to start up their generators, or in other cases reduce the demand on the grid. So the typical requirements of that would be to provide several megawatts of generation, respond to the utility signal typically within 20 minutes or so, sustain that response for a minimum of 2 hours, and then respond again within a short recovery period, not more than 20 hours. So you're always on standby, ready to react to what the grid needs when they need it. So in terms of how you do that, the data center obviously participate in that store involves supplying the grid from its own on-site generation. And in order to do that, you're probably going to have to increase the capacity of your on-site generation to make sure you can cater for supplying the grid, but also make sure you're supporting your critical load at those unforeseen times where generation on the grid is potentially being compromised. And then the final one would be in terms of frequency response. And we see that one potentially being one of the more lucrative in demand response opportunities moving forward. This is where the utility encounters an unplanned power generation issue, or there's a severe load balance in the network, which is starting to cause frequency stability problems. And there's three types of response to that. You have fast frequency response, which is provided just for a few seconds until the utility frequency event is passed or it's been able to be stabilized. You then have the the frequency containment reserve, which is typically provided for like 30 seconds to bring the frequency back into a new steady state. And then the final option there is the frequency restoration reserve, which is typically provided for 30 seconds after you've had the disturbance, and is used to typically restore the frequency to a normal value in the network. So that's the four main ones I would say that are potential options for data centers at this current moment in time. It's just a means of people being willing to participate in getting involved with aggregators to help support that integration with the utility grid, and then everyone buying into to be able to provide these types of services to the grid. And then ultimately the data center has to be able to make some form of capital gain from it, to make an investment up front. They want to see some returns on that investment, so there has to be some fairly substantial deals in terms of how that can be achieved moving forward.
Okay, you mentioned aggregators, so again, you can explain more detail in simple terms. Is that the idea that rather than every single individual data center dealing with utilities, they would deal with a middle organization that would deal with, say, 20 data centers, aggregate their power supply according to some of those different demand response scenarios you outlined, and then they would then sort of sell those on to utilities? Is that how that works?
Yeah, so if you think of an aggregator as an energy service provider who can increase and moderate that electricity consumption across individual data centers, or like you say, potentially groups of data centers, or a group of data centers owned by the one organization. So that aggregator can operate on behalf of those that individual group, or as a more larger group, to produce their own energy and sell that excess energy back to the grid. So the benefits of operating with an aggregator would be to promote competition in terms of the energy market. It gives the data centers access to potentially more competitive energy rates from a buying perspective, but when you start to look at demand response, more importantly from a selling perspective, moving forward, it also helps take away some of those complexities of participating in the demand response, because aggregators, they've been through it, they've seen the challenges, they've seen the problems, they've been able to resolve them in the past. So it helps to make that a much more simplified process. And then they also help with the decisions associated with what type of demand response is going to be the most beneficial implementation for that data center, depending on what demand response services they could potentially offer. But then again, there is the downside of utilising an aggregator, and that is they're going to take a share of that revenue that the data center would ultimately want to achieve.
And I guess the crux of this is the fact that I think we mentioned earlier, data centers exist for a particular reason, and at the moment, at least, the sort of the power generation part of them is incidental. But clearly, they have the expertise, because they all watch the energy market and buy power, futures and all that. So they have some expertise. In a nutshell, are we expecting them to expand that expertise to become more expert at power, maybe develop more resources themselves, microgrids, so they're almost self-sufficient, and then occasionally they access utilities, but in its essence, it's the other way around. So they're actually generating more power than they need, so they can then sell it to the grid, etc. Just your thoughts on how that sort of balance, because I said traditionally data centers just buy power off a utility, so that's very simple, but this is getting much more complicated. Just your thoughts onto how that landscape is likely, or you would hope it would evolve.
I think in the short term, it will be done through aggregators, because they've got the expertise. But as it starts to become more normal to act as a demand response service, then I think you will start to see that coming in-house with a lot of data center operators, because like you say, there is a lot of expertise within client operations at the moment. And as they start to get more experienced working with aggregators and start to learn where the pitfalls are, where the opportunities are, then I think that they'll start to consider that themselves moving forward. But I think the other factor in it is it's how you can generate the best energy rates, and whether or not that's achievable by an individual organisation on their own, or using that aggregator who can collate a number of organisations together to help lower that energy rate and increase the selling rate of that energy. That's the bit it's a bit grey for me at the moment, because the aggregators had that experience for a number of years at the moment. They've got a lot more influence on the utility, and ultimately they can drive those competitive energy rates moving forward. And I just don't know if the end users and the operators can do that at this moment in time, but I'm sure that will change in the coming years.
And in terms of, I mean, we mentioned earlier the fact that the industry hasn't participated so far, but I mean, are there any particular barriers right now to this more widespread? I mean, I'm thinking just, you know, a lot of organisations, say, you know, data centres, they operating on behalf of clients. You know, if God forbid, you know, they give them more power than they should have to a utility, and suddenly somebody's server wasn't working. I guess that's the scenario they dread, but that's fairly unlikely, I guess, with you know, good management practice in place. But what other barriers are there in terms of what needs to happen to get the data center industry more interested in this?
Like I say, I don't think there's much more than what we touched on previously. The big thing, I think, is the lack of awareness. That's one of the main factors, and the other main factor is the perceived risk of the IT load being dropped when you're participating in these demand response opportunities. There's obviously the big factor in terms of a lot of the existing sites at the moment are all operating with diesel generators still at the moment, and we all know the emissions from an environmental perspective are not good from a diesel perspective. So that will present its own challenges in terms of providing any sort of grid support from a demand response in terms of operating in island mode. But off the back of that, we do have a lot of sites that have got a lot of UPSs on them, have a lot of capacity in terms of storage energy, in terms of the UPSs and battery systems. So that could be an option in the short term to get the ball moving in terms of the demand response, and that would fall into the frequency response scenario. So I think that would potentially be one of the first things moving forward. But like I said before, the main issues, I would say, would be just the lack of awareness and demand response, and just affecting that critical load is where the barriers are at the moment still.
And in terms of, I mean, regulation, the data center industry, as many others, are largely self-regulating around the environment, although governments are increasingly becoming interested. Do you think there's an opportunity for regulation to make demand response more attractive, or is it up to the data center industry plus the utilities just to get their heads together and work this out?
I think over time there will be some form of regulation. Like I said, with demand response service, it's complex and it's evolving all the time. The extent of the demand response services that are available, they're pretty complex. There's certain things that are available in certain countries at the moment that aren't available in other countries. So all of that has to start to become aligned. So in simple terms, I think that the right regulations need to be put in place, and that will help to make those demand response opportunities far more attractive to data centers moving forward as well.
Okay, and before you go, this is not to do with demand response, but hopefully you might be able to have some thoughts. The current you know, chaos, if you like, in the energy market for the consumers, at least, you know, with the prices. I know the data center industry does buy into the future quite a long way, but can you foresee this current chaos? I mean, if it lasts, will data center prices have to go up because of the energy they're buying? It goes up significantly, or will prices sort of stabilize long before the contracts these data center operators have bought, you know, run out? How do you see that?
It's a real difficult one, isn't it? like you said, the data centres are probably tied into long-term agreements at the moment, and they'll be hoping that those agreements see them through this current peak. But moving forward, there is a huge demand on the networks, on energy, and like you said at the beginning of the call, we're needing more and more energy all the time. Industries are growing, developing countries are growing and evolving, which are going to have more emphasis on energy moving forward. So over time, I can only see the cost of energy increasing, and with that cost of energy increasing and the reliance that the grid has on renewable energy and the decarbonisation of the grid, in order for data centres to help try and alleviate that pressure from a cost point of view, if they can start to participate in these demand response opportunities, then they help to bring that energy cost down by exporting that energy that they're not using, whether it be through battery storage or BESS systems on site or operating in island mode. That only has to surely help to reduce their ongoing energy costs, albeit it has to be balanced with the initial capital cost of installing the extra systems to allow them to participate in these demand response opportunities moving forward. And I think we will also start to see some more reliance on gas generation on site. So as opposed to using diesel, operating with gas, and then potentially if hydrogen does become a potential opportunity in the years to come, then there may be the opportunity for hydrogen generation on site, which then adds in a whole different mix to the energy costs and how data centres mitigate those high costs in the future.
Okay, so maybe just some final thoughts in terms of demand response. If we say at the moment the industry is, I won't say completely non-participatory, but it's in the very early days, what would you like to see happen over the next, assuming that business returns to something like normal, what would you like to see the data industry sort of doing over the next, I don't know, couple of years in terms of the demand response opportunity?
So I think that the easiest thing at the moment would be to utilise, for example, your UPSs. We've got UPSs on 95% of the data centres across the UK and the world ultimately. So you've got a lot of stored energy there, and by utilising the correct type of batteries there, then there is the opportunity to participate in the frequency response, and that tends to yield fairly substantial returns in terms of what you can get back from the utility grid. So I think that would be the first port of call. You've got the UPS infrastructure there. You've got the additional redundancy in the UPSs in terms of your topology configurations. So you've got that capacity there that you can utilise on day one. In terms of the on-site generation and operating in island mode, that's really dependent on what that grid emission factor is, which is then also really dependent on the location and how the grid in that location operates, whether it's still using coal or it's predominantly using wind and solar on the grid. That's going to really determine what you can do from a generation perspective in terms of diesel, gas, hydrogen, etc. moving forward. So I think that will take a little bit longer, and environmental agencies all have to start to buy into what those lower carbon emission producing engines are, and then that will help us to determine if it's going to be a viable option in specific locations.
Okay, well, it's been great to chat. I've certainly expanded my knowledge of demand response, and how the data industry can use it moving forward. So, Kerr, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Yeah, great, appreciate it. Thanks very much. Nice talking.